Hi, I'm Hector Del Castillo, and I'd like to welcome all of you to today's discussion. Today's topic is Innovate Your Planning Process, and today's speaker is Steve Johnson of Under 10 Consulting. And Steve, go ahead and we're actually expecting this, so would love to see what you have to say about the planning process for products. Welcome.
All right. Well, thank you very much. So, quickly on me, I've spent the last 25 years consulting with product companies, and what I found is chaos. In fact, in a survey last year, 47% of the respondents indicated that process was the biggest challenge for for product management in their company. And in another similar survey, three things were the top issues. The lifecycle process was ad hoc. It was ill-defined. Product innovation was ill-defined, and an inconsistent process for managing the portfolio. Process is a mess, and I think that's why so many teams succeed through individual heroics, despite the company's best efforts to prevent it. It seems like process is not part of the solution. Its process is what you have to work your way around to get something accomplished. And I worked for a billion-dollar software company, and I was so frustrated because they had so many processes and checkpoints and gates and go no-goes and everything else. And you just couldn't get anything done. And I got recruited into a startup. And in the startup, I thought, well, this is going to be great. There's going to be no process. And a week later, I was pulling my hair out because there was no freaking process. I mean, anybody could do anything, and they were, and I would look at a release candidate and I'd find 4 or 5 or 6 features that no one had ever told me about. And I'm like, how did that get in there? And, a developer would say, well, I was in the code anyway, and I thought this would be really cool. And then, I'd find something else, and they're like, well, where'd that come from? And they're like, oh yeah, the president came in and he said, I was thinking about the product in my drive this morning, and I thought it'd be really cool if we had this feature. So they took that as a mandate and went forward with it. And so in my experience, this huge company had so much process you couldn't get anything done. And in this small company, we had no process and couldn't really get anything done. But we need some process, and we need something more than a cocktail napkin. We need a process, a little bit of rigor to go from idea to an excellent product in the market. And if we're not careful, if we don't have a process, we end up with products like this. This is the Swiss Army knife from hell, I call it. This was actually a kind of a gag. The company that makes Swiss Army knives introduced a few thousand of these for their 100th anniversary. And it was every single blade they had ever put on a knife. And it was just a gag. It was supposed to be in the window of a knife store. But as I looked at it, I thought, well, this is just like every product I've ever used, particularly any enterprise product. And so what we want to talk about today is, how can we go through some sort of process to turn ideas into excellent products? And unfortunately, most of the industry's attention is on the middle. There's not much about ideation. There's not much about delivery. It's mostly, Scrum and SAFe and story mapping and design thinking. It's all about the middle. But in product management, we also have to worry about the edges. How do we really get good ideas? And interesting, a survey that I don't have a copy of in this presentation that I encountered just a few days ago. The number one source of great ideas, not surprising to me, is by engaging with customers. And the least valuable is ideas from the sales force. So we need some way of getting ideas and going through these wonderful techniques of design thinking and story mapping and Scrum and SAFe. But we need a process beyond that. And one more just rant. I attended a session with a Scrum expert, and somebody said, well, when does product management do the rest of product management? And he was befuddled, other than participating in ceremonies with development, This person had no concept that product management had to do anything else. So Coopers and Edgett a few years ago wrote that simply having a best process, simply having a formal process is itself a best practice. And then going way back in time, Edwards Deming said, if you can't describe what you're doing as a process, then you don't know what you're doing. And when I work with teams and I ask them, how would you describe your process? The answer I get is ad hoc, inconsistent, and heroics. So if your process isn't achieving its outcomes, it's time to change your process. And so what happens is we form a team. We bring a bunch of people together to design our process. And we pull in people from all over the organization because it's a cross-functional problem. And they almost always come up with something like this. You know, we have all these stages and gates and go, no go and this and that, and all these ceremonies and artifacts and deliverables. And they're all kind of in like an ideal scenario. And they all fail for the same reason. And that is learning occurs before and after, but not during. And the reality is building products isn't linear like this. And then we learned all about lean startup, right? Lean startup says, well, build some stuff, measure, learn, build some more stuff. But there's so much more to product management than just build. In fact, it begins with discovery. So I've kind of recasted this, or a team I worked with recasted this around 3 phases. There's the discovery phase where we figure out what we need to build. There's the describe phase where we work with a dev team to build it. And then there's the delivery phase. So discover is all about finding problems to solve. Describing is all about articulating to your creation team the personas and their problems. And then delivery is about getting it into the market. And in between those nodes, there's committing with business deliverables. There's the actual creation process, which is where Scrum lives. And then there's the connect process, which is where, you know, sales enablement occurs or sales training occurs. And with this model, we're able to see that learning is at the core. Learning should be continuous. It doesn't happen at the beginning and the end. It happens every day. So here are the phases of a modern product lifecycle, and we call it the Quartz Open Framework. I worked with a team of product experts to develop this framework to help us design more than just the create stage or more than just the go-to-market stage, but to look at the entire product holistically. And it's likely that you'll have products in anywhere along the way. I mean, you'll take a product all the way through, and then guess what? You'll have another product that's also going through, and a third product that's going through. And in my world, I have joined companies at all of those stages. You know, I got hired one time for a product that was getting ready to be launched. And the developer said, golly, I'm glad to have you here, so we'll have somebody to blame if this doesn't go well. I was hired in another case to kick off a product. So it's likely you have products in different areas simultaneously, and maybe even multiple products in multiple stages. And so I think of this framework as really a method of methods. I mean, as you get into each of those nodes, there are entire methodologies built around just that one step. Design thinking is really about, describing problems and, zooming out and zooming in. And we've got story mapping and Scrum and Lean and Scrum of Scrums and Less and Safe, all really focus pretty much on the create part. And then I've worked through the years with different sales methodologies, different marketing methodologies. I have a buddy who has an entire company focused on launch methods. And that's primarily about, the connect to the market. So what you find is this framework gives you a way of structuring all the different work that product managers, and for that matter, business managers, need to focus on. And it can be a helpful tool in our next section on how to design your process from discovery to connect and learn. But let me pause for a second and see if anybody has any questions.
I don't. I mean, it makes complete sense that like the learning needs to happen throughout. I feel like Scrum puts a lot of the emphasis of learning at the end with the retrospective.
Yes.
So,
Well, and yet, the good news is that, at least in the Agile Manifesto, they say they embrace change. I mean, the way Scrum in particular was designed was to say, we're only committing to 2 weeks at a time. So if you learn something new, we can adjust our plans accordingly. And the big rule is, but you can't mess with what we're working on during a sprint. But you can mess with what we're going to do in the next sprint. But I still agree with you. I find that for most teams, there's very little learning and there's a whole lot of execution.
I would agree. I just had my first workshop that was virtual. It was basically a design sprint with the team that had never done one before. So I had never done one remotely. So that was its own challenge. So I felt like I did all the research, had everything prepared, and it was definitely really challenging. And I like this very simplified view because I love the pragmatic framework, but it's got too many squares. So this kind of, I wish I had this before because then I would have had something simple to get them to understand. We tried a couple different workflows of like, this is why you go from here to here, and it just did not connect at all. So love this. Good. Well, and your problem that you've articulated there is this kind of the same one I did. I mean, after 15 years with Pragmatic, I started my company, and the joke of my company name, it's a terrible company name, it turns out, but my intent was to say, you can't do all the 37 boxes of the Pragmatic Framework. You can only do maybe, under 10 of them. And, at the time I thought I was so clever. And then since then, everybody's like, now, why did you call your company that? But anyway, yes, I too needed something that expressed this in an iterative way rather than what appears to be a serial or a linear way. Okay, so let me show you how you use this to design your own process. And here's the thing. Your company is unique. There is no other organization like yours. The people are different. The objectives are different. The diversity is different. The values are different. Why do we think using somebody else's process will work for us? And so one thing that is a phrase that I have always disliked and only recently came to understand why was I kind of disliked the phrase best practices. Because what's best for my company is not what's best for your company. We're all, and I mean this in the right way. I mean, we're all unique as people and as organizations. And so I argue that you can design your own process if you have an open structure like the Quartz Open Framework to work from. And more than best practices, I prefer to think of standard deliverables, consistency within the company, not so much, this is the way they do it at the company across the street or the company across town. But if high growth is your goal, high growth organizations are twice as likely to have and use standard deliverables. So what are those? And this is where, I think that you've got an opportunity to define the ideal process for yourself. So we can take this method, this framework of frameworks, and for each one of them, articulate what deliverables are necessary in each phase. So I always start with discovery in the market. So let me show you the smallest possible process.
begins with customer interviews. We've identified a customer we want to serve. Maybe that's a prospect in sales talk, but really it's a kind of customer, what we would call a persona. But we do some interviews, some customer discovery interviews. And from that, we build a one-page business canvas that says, hey, I want to build this product and I need to get some funding. And so I'm either going to go to my parents or my children or my in-laws and get some money. Or more likely in your world, you're going to go upstairs. You're going to go present to the leadership team and say, can I have a few $1 million, please? And then we'll describe the problem we're trying to solve in story format, doing what's called a backlog, I'm sure you're familiar with. And then development goes off and builds things, and we keep track of what they're doing using Kanban. Then, while development is creating something with and we're tracking it with Kanban, we sit down with sales and marketing and develop a launch plan. And if you really want sales to be successful, you need to give them a sales playbook. And that's a pretty simple process, but it seems a little too simple. So if you think about the things that you're doing today and the things that you go, actually, I think I want to keep doing that. Where would they fit in this kind of a model? And so here's a similar tool, which is hugely overwhelming, for an enterprise SaaS solution. And they had multiple things in each area. And, I won't go too far into them, but, I won't go into them at all. But if you look in the upper right-hand corner, in the discovery, they do customer discovery, they define the problem to be solved, they do something called opportunity scoring, and then they take the result and put it into a product canvas. The product canvas is a one-page business case or a prototype of a business case, and then they go to leadership and say, would you like to hear more? And leadership says, oh, this sounds great, we should run with it. And you go, hang on, we've got to go to the commit phase. So let's validate this in the market. Let's do our financial model. Let's clarify what success looks like. Maybe we really will build a business case or a business plan. And then we'll brief the executive team to get a final go, no go. And that's just for those blue parts, discover and commit. And I'll send you a copy of these slides afterwards so you can really drill down into these. But most of you probably will find this familiar language. And maybe this is a tad heavy for your organization, maybe a few documents too many. And so somewhere in the middle is what I call the no chaos process. This is what I teach at Under 10. And it's pretty much what we just saw a moment ago. Isolate problems and personas, calculate an opportunity score, create a product vision canvas, brief the executive teams, and get the go ahead to do more work. Because I've written my share of business cases and I never want to have to do that again unless we're really going to go forward. I hate to write a business case and have somebody say, oh, well, we're selling the company, so we're not going to do any more products. Or I hate to write a business case and have, for any reason, somebody say, yeah, we're not going to do that. So having gotten that first go ahead and the agreement to explore committing, we do the things we talked about a moment ago: perform market validation, do a financial model, clarify success criteria, and maybe create a business plan. And yet many of the teams I work with pretty much skip that. The executive team has become satisfied with a product vision canvas and a financial plan, plus maybe probably a roadmap. Then we'll describe who are our personas and what are their problems. We'll prioritize those problems and use that to develop our roadmap, and then brief our technical teams with that information so that they can start building things. And while they start building things, we're going to use Kanban to keep track of what they're working on. We're going to formalize discovery and acceptance. And one of the chief roles during that process is not really an artifact or an activity, except to minimize interference with the development team or the create team. Meanwhile, while development is creating, we coordinate with marketing and sales to determine a launch date. And you launch not when the code is done, not when the product is ready, but when the market is ready. So we'll align the launch with market rhythms. We'll determine what launch activities are necessary. And just as we did with development, we'll use Kanban to monitor the prioritized work and use that to brief our go-to-market teams. Then when we connect with the market, the product management role evolves into monitoring. How's this going? Are we achieving our success metrics? This is where product management, or more likely product marketing, is doing win-loss analysis. And then we'll also perform a process retrospective. So that's a pretty meaty sort of process. But this is what I think is necessary to build products in today's world. And depending on your experience in your company, most of this may be very familiar to you. It may not. I mean, some of it may be new. But as I worked with teams, as I worked with teams to figure out what's the minimum set that mitigates our risk while minimizing the amount of nonsense we spend time on, this is what I came up with. And here's how you can do your own. Write down everything you're doing. All the things, the activities, the artifacts, the ceremonies, the deliverables, write them all down, and then slot them into where do they fit in this template. And as you then look at the result, you say, there's some things missing that we don't have anything like, depending on some of the technical organizations I work with, they don't have anything for deliver and connect. They don't have any way of supporting the launch process or the selling process. It's just like, hey, we finished the code, we're done. We're going to release it into the wild. So that's really the question. What's in your playbook? At the highest level, you want to discover problems, commit to solve them, describe the problems to your creation team so they can design and build solutions, then prepare the organization to take this thing to market, and then ultimately connect with the market through good sales and marketing practices. And with this framework, you should be able to define a process that fits your company's risk versus reward, if you will. I don't want to spend a lot of time in meetings, or I don't want to spend a lot of time writing papers and documents that nobody's going to read, but looking at the things that you're doing today that are working, let's put them in here. And looking at those things that are not working, let's leave them out. But have we informed everybody who needs to be informed at every step along the way, with learning at the core? Ultimately, the goal of creating your own playbook is the goal of product management. The goal is to turn good ideas into successful products systematically. So what do you think? Do you believe you are ready to design your own process? That was a real question. That wasn't rhetorical.
There was a big pause.
Yeah.
I think I can kind of fine tune what we have. Luckily, we don't have a lot of documents that we have to write, which, hooray, fireworks, everything. We mostly use like lean canvases and the such, the like, but trying to get people to understand how to get the information in and where all this stuff comes from has definitely been a challenge. I've worked at places that had a much more mature process where everybody understood exactly what are we doing, why do we do it. So all of that, we just got bought, by the way. So when I'd been working before, I was kind of working behind the scenes, and it was the same thing where don't look behind the black curtain. Try and get people to like, and I would try and get people involved, but they were just like, okay, well, am I supposed to act on this now? I'm like, oh, cry, tears. But now, because we got pulled into another company that is more into collaboration with the actual delivery teams, which I'm a huge fan of. It's been a jarring change. So being able to kind of use this as more of a framework and take what was working and what hasn't been working will definitely help. I tried using the Silicon Valley product group has like a really good graphic of here's the things you do along the way. And the company I'm working at now, they use a variation of that, but it wasn't resonating with these teams coming from a very like, tell me what to do to pull me into the process earlier. So I'm going to try this out for my next design sprint.
Great. Well, it's a very helpful tool, and I think very much if you write down all the things that people ask you for, you write down all the artifacts you've ever seen before, and not just artifacts, but also meetings and ceremonies. There's a place there for all of them, and if you find, golly, we've got 17 documents in one of these squares, you're like, man, do we really need that many? Well, I'll do it. What usually happens with me when I'm doing consulting around this is people say, well, Steve, I still think we need a business requirements document. And I go, okay, cool. What goes in your business requirements document? And they start listing off all these things. And somebody in the room will say, wait a minute, dude, you're not explaining a business requirements document. You're describing a market requirements document. And I'm like, oh, okay. So what goes in that? And they're like, it's this and this and this and this and this. And somebody else goes, dude, you're not describing a market requirements document. You're describing a product requirements document. And I'm like, if you can't even agree on the outline, maybe we don't need a BRD and a MRD. CYARDs. Instead, can we build a small number of living documents? Adriana, what do you think? You're all Scrum. You're certified now as a Scrum Master. Are you realizing that there's a whole lot more to product management than what we learned about in Scrum?
Yeah, well, I'm still I'm reconciling everything with that versus everything with this. I think my biggest struggle too as a product manager is how much detail to go into. That's the thing I struggle the most with. I think I came from development too, and that doesn't help. So I always have to figure out how to get myself to back up, if that makes sense. So
yeah. Well, I think honestly, the big challenge for developers moving into a product role is we're very stuck on solutioning.
Yeah.
I already know what I want. How do I trick you into building what I want by using your silly user story format?
Yeah.
But, my approach, and I'm sure Hector's as well, is to say, let me tell you a story. Let me tell you a story about Jennifer, who's got an unreliable ex-husband who invariably forgets to pick up their daughter from school. And you're like, dude, what happened with Jennifer? You get really interested in the persona and the real problem. And then, it goes crazy with innovation as they're like, hey, we could do this. We could add an app to her phone. We could build a GPS tracking thing. We could put a chip under the skin of her neck like a dog. I mean, there are so many cool things we could do. Now we have to worry about whether any of that was legal. But I think that Scrum and in particular, I'm a big believer in Kanban, but I think Scrum is great, but it only touches 1/6 of product management. Actually 1/7, because it doesn't really have learning in it either. Quartz Open Framework is available in Creative Commons license, so you can use it and modify it in your organization. There's also, for what it's worth, a certification available for Quartz if you want one more on your resume of being a product professional, a Quartz certified product professional. Go to quartzopen.com/certification-information. Our goal was to create something that we could all use that wasn't proprietary or connected to a specific methodology. We didn't want it to be the Scrum version of a plan or somebody else's version. We wanted it to be your version. And also on our website is a number of templates in each of those categories for you to use at no cost.